Now call Deputy Tommy Broughan.
Thanks, Lascian. I'm delighted to have the brief opportunity here to speak on this very important bill. And at the outset, I'd like to say that I welcome and strongly support it. And I know the Low Pay Commission, of course, has actually been operational since February of this year. And I understand the first report will be due in the very near future, Minister, and we look forward to that. So I welcome legislation providing the, if you like, the legislative or the constitutional legislative bulwark for the national minimum wage and amending the National Minimum Wage Act of 2000. And of course, it does remain to be seen how it will develop and protect the lives, I think, of workers, of hundreds of thousands of low-paid workers over coming years and decades. Nearly 5% of all our workers, of course, just over, I think, 73,000 workers are earning the national minimum wage of €8.65. And of course, this is the experienced adult rate, and those who are starting out in employment or in structured training are on the reduced rates of perhaps 70 to 90% of the national minimum wage. The lower paid sectors of the Irish economy, of course, are typically those in the restaurant hospitality sectors, those who are working as carers, particularly senior carers, or carers rather for seniors, cleaners, in security, in retail, and of course younger people. And many of us in this House, of course, would have experience of those professions when we were starting out in our careers and at times when we were studying. Indeed, there is also, of course, a distinct gender bias, as Deputy Maloney said, and has been noted by the National Women's Council of Ireland, because this is a gender issue, because 60% of workers on low pay, of course, are women. And we know that 50% of women in Ireland are earning less than €20,000. Women, younger people, migrants, and those working in lower skilled jobs such as trainees, apprentices, in areas like hairdressing, the clerical office work, even of course in the public sector, though admittedly more so in the private than in the public, are those who are most affected by lower pay and zero-hour contracts. Employer organisations, of course, have argued, Minister, I know you've had widespread consultations, that we have the 5th highest national minimum wage rate in the European Union. But this argument, of course, totally ignores the higher living costs of our country. Higher wage economies like ours come with very high costs of living. We only have to think, for example, of energy costs, which your colleague Minister White is doing nothing to address, mortgage costs, rental costs, extortionate childcare costs, transport costs, and we've very, public transport systems that are totally lacking compared to so many other countries. So I think that argument falls on its face. Over the past number of decades, of course, Laskin Corla, and especially since the economic crash, the ideal of social Europe seems to have been buried by fiscal and general economic neoliberal conservatism. A feature of this new harsh economic Europe is a steady fall in wages across many Eurozone economies. As an article in the Guardian newspaper said earlier this week, discussing the failures of the Eurozone, and said that since the introduction of the single currency, wages across Europe have been driven down. Of course, workers have been used, if you like, and their wage rates and conditions have been used as the mechanism to make economies, as our leaders in Brussels and Frankfurt would say, to make our economies more efficient. They have borne the brunt of this, Minister. But in fact, one of the workforces that has borne the heaviest brunt, indeed, is the German workforce. Because in 14 years, German workers have hardly seen any wage rises. According to the article, the higher skilled, higher paid jobs are disappearing out of Germany to much lower paid states in the Eastern and South East Europe. And Gerhard Bosch, a German expert in inequality, said lower paid jobs and the numbers of the low-paid workforce are now almost at United States levels. And of course there is a kind of, if you like, that neoliberal movement to try and transform the European economy into an American-type economy, a totally different economy and constitutional, economic, political setup, which I don't think we should emulate on this continent. More recently, of course, our focus has been on Greece, and let me say, it's the first opportunity I've had to say it, Lascian, I find the words of Finance Minister Noonan, the weasel words of the Taoiseach and Minister Noonan in relation to the Greek crisis to be disgraceful and an affront, I think, to the Irish people. I think we are naturally in solidarity with the Greek nation and recognise them as the home of European civilization and as a valiant and hard-working people who have been, absolutely traumatised by vicious austerity for 7.5 years. So I look forward tomorrow or Friday, Minister, that your government will, be able to stand over some sort of a settlement with the Greek nation, which gives them reasonable prospects for the way ahead and doesn't bury them further in the ground under this crushing austerity. But the crisis and phenomenon, of course, of austerity is not just contained to Greece. And as I said to Taoiseach Minister Humphreys this morning, the housing and homeless crisis, of course, is the legacy of your term, Minister, and their term in government. And of course, it's of Greek proportions, given what's happened to homelessness and housing in Greece. Across Europe, we are seeing an increase in austerity and a concentration of low pay in many sectors. And the media, controlled very often by very wealthy segments of the economy, as we've seen, or very wealthy individuals in society, have this relentless mantra of constantly, cutting back on the rewards for workers, and very often making an argument that makes no economic sense and certainly doesn't make political sense. But across Europe, as I said, the rich continue to grow their wealth, the poor and the ordinary people are feeling the pinch the most. And while the banks got bailed out, Europe's ordinary citizens were sold out. And what happened, of course, Minister, therefore, to the social Europe of Jean Monnet and Jacques Delors, of great people great visionaries in the foundation of Europe, and indeed in the Socialist and Democratic Party in the European Union, founding fathers of the Europe and of the Euro, and we're now looking at this landscape of ferocious pressure on workers and on a downward spiral on wages. So in that context, I welcome this bill in front of us today. Section 4, of course, outlines the duties of the Low Pay Commission, and it states, I think it's a good phrase, it's designed to assist as many low-paid workers as is reasonably practical, and that over time the national minimum rate is progressively increased. And I know that we had the contrast with the British system over the years, with the incremental rate rises, whereas in our own country, it's we had these kind of huge stops and jumps, stop-start. And again, I would commend the Minister for seeking to address that. The 2006, of course, ERSI study found that irregularly adjusting the minimum wage can have a detrimental impact on employment, as it can create uncertainty for workers and indeed employers. And the study noted that smaller incremental increases, which might follow from this legislation, were preferable, and so I welcome those provisions. Minister, however, why have you chosen to retain the power to accept or reject the recommendation by the Commission as outlined in Section 6? I mean, I would be hopeful that always the recommendation would be positive. Why did you decide, for example, to follow, you might respond to, the UK's model of keeping the Low Pay Commission in an advisory role, as opposed to the new German Mindesjan Commission, the Minimum Wage Commission there, which started, I think, in January, which is the same set-up as the Irish Low Pay Commission? Or rather, why didn't you decide to follow that model? And I note that the structure of that Irish Low Pay Commission is similar to those other two large European economies. I do agree, as you've said, I think, in some of your opening remarks, that a consensus-based approach is usually the best approach to take regarding recommendations on public policy. But however, consensus may be difficult to reach with employers in many sectors of the economy that I've outlined, which are historically characterised by very low pay rates. It can be particularly difficult when we already have statements from organisations like the Small Firms Association criticising the functioning of the Commission, as well as the likelihood of a recommendation to increase the minimum wage this year. I completely disagree with the argument, of course, that increasing the minimum wage will automatically lead to those on higher pay scales demanding increases too. I think, in fact, it would be beneficial for the economy. Schedule 2 of the bill, of course, provides for the membership of the Commission and seeks to strike a balance between those representing the low-paid workers, representing employers, those representing employers, and also the two, that's 3 in each case, and the 2 experts on the with proven competence in economic research and statistical analysis. I did ask a parliamentary question, I think, earlier in the year, Minister, about the way those the members were chosen, and yeah, I think you gave me a reasonable answer on that. Earlier this year, of course, TASC, our think tank for action and social change, they released a research paper cherishing all equally economic inequality in Ireland, which highlighted growing inequalities in our country. The research indicated that Ireland is currently, and I quote, the most unequal country in the EU before taxes and social welfare payments are included. This confirms the importance of progressive taxation and social protection such as this piece of legislation. And as I previously stated during discussions in the Dáil, the TASC report cogently notes that the two poles of economic inequality are the concentration of income and wealth on the one hand and the number of people unable to meet their material needs on the other. Various IMF studies, of course, have shown that reducing income inequality through redistributive methods doesn't hurt economic growth, but it actually helps it. Indeed, at TASC's annual conference, which took place on Friday last in Croke Park, Professor Olzem Omran, a leading international economist based in the University of Greenwich, suggested that a pay rise generally across Europe would stimulate growth. Professor Omran argued that, and I quote, wage moderation policies are counterproductive and lead to a stagnation of economic growth. She went on to explain that her research, which included Ireland, showed a fall in wages leads to lower consumption because workers spend more as a proportion of their income compared to those who earn income from profit. I noticed the Pubble HP Index, Minister, and the studies of small areas of the Irish population has been an ongoing process over the years, and I just wondered to what extent the Low Pay Commission will address the disparities in costs for workers across the country and in different parts of the country. We'd be both familiar with some of the more urban costs. I know you represent urban and rural as well, but that's an important area, I think, also that the Commission hopefully will look at. The other point I just wanted to ask you is, will the Low Pay Commission have a role in examining a living wage in further detail? The Taoiseach told me on a number of occasions in earlier debates that this was an idea that she was very much in favour of. I've long been a supporter of the idea of introducing a national living wage as well. It was first advocated, I think, in the UK, or when I first became aware of it, by the community coalition known as London Citizen. They began the campaign based on the principle of fairness and have made great impacts on the adoption of a living wage in various areas of the UK, even agreeing a model for calculating the living wage, which is then reported each year. And in Ireland, of course, the living wage has been calculated by ICTU, the Congress of Trade Unions, to be currently €11.45 an hour, very considerably higher than even the minimum wage we have now, significantly higher. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, of course, Article 25, and the UN International Covenant on Economic and Cultural Rights 1996, Article 11, both highlight the right to an adequate standard of living, and a living wage is defined as one which makes possible a minimum acceptable standard of living. Indeed, at the beginning of May, Minister, I asked parliamentary questions whether you might consider introducing a living wage and continue the tradition that Deputy Maloney was talking about. I was told at the time you had a deep interest in the living wage initiative and that you were going to hold a forum on it at some stage this year. So just wonder what was the outcome of that, whether we had the forum, and again what input it might have into the discussions on the actual minimum wage. Nicola Sturgeon, of course, the current, I suppose we should say, great First Minister of Scotland. In fact, she's the other Taoiseach, as you know, Lascan, two Taoiseachs in these islands. Leader of the Scottish National Party and of Scotland. She's been brave enough, of course, to ask business in Scotland to sign up to a 9-point Scottish business pledge where the pay would be at least £7.85 an hour. And instead of the current minimum wage of €6.50. The pledge is part of a campaign to promote fairness and economic growth. Yeah, that would be over €11 an hour, in fact. Indeed, Neary's paper from March 2014, A Living Wage for Ireland, Some Consideration and Initial Estimates, also concluded that the implementation of a living wage offers significant potential to enhance the living standards of low-income workers and their families. So this is something that I think we could look at longer term, Minister, as a core objective of social policy in this country. So I'd agree that the national minimum wage, the Commission bill today, is a good step in the right direction, but there's certainly more we can do and should be done to help the lower income workers. Of course, earlier on this year, Minister, you and I think 70 others voted against me in relation to my High Pay and Wealth Commission bill. I think we lost that vote by 71 votes to 26. And the High Pay and Wealth Commission, of course, provided for the establishment of the High Pay and Wealth Commission on a permanent basis in the CSO. I mean, that was one of your big oppositions, I think, to the bill, the fact that I was putting it in the CSO. But I only did that because it has, obviously, it would have an expenditure, and you can't have, I think, a charge in the Exchequer if you try and come in here and bring in some, legislation. But it was to carry out, as you know, research on all levels of pay and wealth in the state, and I think that's the way forward, and to inform public policy, because, I mean, coming up to October and general election campaign, we're all going to be trying to put forward the best possible plan we can for the Irish people for the next 4 or 5 years. But sometimes we don't know what we're talking about. We don't know the realities of the make-up. And as some people have said so often, if you're in Norway or if you're in Sweden, you simply can phone up the revenue or their equivalent of CSO, and you can find out what Minister Nash has paid, what I'm paid, what everyone in this building has paid, and everyone in the country, and what we all paid last year. And it gives you an idea, therefore, sometimes some surprising information of how then you could frame taxation policy for the most efficient. So I think the Low Pay Commission, the low pay idea, it's only part of what we need to do. We need to look at everything and say, you know, like who is worth what. Well, for example, we've had these obscene levels of pay before the crash, obscene levels of pay in the banking industry and financial services industry, you know, where maybe €500,000 last can is regarded as, you know, chicken feed, as only a very minor kind of a salary, and people wanted 3 and 4 and 5 and sometimes up to maybe 70 or 80 million. That type of obscenity, and then, you know, some of the political representatives of those people then are calling for, you know, harsh measures to contain costs and to contain wages at the lower end for the vast bulk of workers. So while your bill before us today, Minister, it is creating this commission to look at the low pay earners. My bill was intended to take the top-down approach to examine levels of very high pay and wealth in the country, but in fact to look across the whole parameters of the private sector and the public sector, and then to inform public policy coming into the budgetary process. So I would hope that in the future, while today is a very important step, and I do commend you on getting us to this point, I would hope that we would go forward so that we know what we're talking about when we look at remuneration, or as the great or the famous AJF O'Reilly used to say, compensation, that the compensation that we all get for doing our various tasks in the economy, that we all know what it is, and that it's very, very clear. So I support the bill before us today, Lascan, and I look forward to receiving the Commission's first report and to the response of the Minister. Thanks, Cabinet.
So now I call on Minister.